My name is Luna Cruz. I am the creative director and one of the co-founders of Altitude Games. We are a Philippine-based studio. We have about 35 employees now. And so today I'll be talking about prototyping, specifically how we prototype at Altitude, and I'll give a bunch of different case studies on when it worked for us and when it didn't. And at the end, I will have some general tips and lessons learned that hopefully can help you in your own studio. So this whole presentation is about prototyping. And there's something very unique about us at Altitude that requires prototyping to be done a lot. And that is we're a virtual office. So what that means is we do have a physical office, but we're never there. 95% of the time we're working from home. And we only go to the office if there's a big meeting or something. And what that means is if you're a designer, and let's say you're having a design discussion and you're arguing about something, everybody's just chatting, and chats can go on for hours and hours, just going around in circles, because everybody loves to argue, everybody believes they're right. I'm sure as game developers you know how this feels, especially if you're a designer. And because we're now working in the same place, that can just go on and on. Or, at the other end of the spectrum, somebody can suddenly decide, no, we're just doing this, right? Everybody just stop talking, we're going to do this. And then the whole team will develop that, but it's pretty much an arbitrary decision. So what we needed at Altitude was a way for the design team in particular, but also all the project teams, to have a way to objectively make decisions that would be shareable, playable through the internet, because again, we couldn't look over each other's shoulders, see how they were working. And prototyping is the best way for us to do that. So basically for us, prototyping is any shareable output that can be done very quickly to make decisions. And shareable is, there are two parts of that sentence that are important. So first is shareable. So that means that it has to be downloadable and playable by any device, anywhere, because again, virtual office, everything is online. And second is it has to be done quickly. So in previous prototyping talks that I've given, I gave the definition that prototyping has to be done quick and dirty. I've removed dirty from the definition because dirty is really just a function of quickly. It just means that if you're trying to do something fast, like coding or drawing or designing something, if you're taking the time out to make it pretty, it's probably too slow. And so for us, as long as it's downloadable and playable, and that it's done quickly, then it's a prototype. And so there are 3 different types of prototyping that we do. So we have 3 types of prototyping. And also what's interesting from when I was making this talk was normally when people say, oh, we totally prototype at our studio, they're talking about a phase, right? So you're saying usually, well, we made a game design document, we're doing paper design and planning, and then you have a prototyping phase where you prototype all these ideas and see if they work. And then after that prototyping phase, that's when you go into full game development. But when I was making the talk, I realized we no longer do it that way. We started that way, but now we actually prototype as a process through all different phases of development. So in paper design, we're doing what we call UX prototyping. In the prototype phase, we're doing what I would call standalone prototyping. And then in the actual development phase, when you're making the real assets, then we're doing in-game prototyping. So those are the 3 different types. So the first would be UX prototyping, and that answers the question, how does something look like? And for example, when we have a booth outside, so we have different games that we're showing there, and one of them is a bubble shooter. So when we were starting to think about, let's make a bubble shooter, what would that look like? I could actually make an entire playable PDF using a tool called Balsamiq Mockups. Does anyone use Balsamiq? Yay, 2 people. From the Philippines, that's not fair. So Balsamiq is software that's actually originally used for web. So what it does is you can very quickly make wireframe mockups of screens, put buttons, and make them clickable, and then you could go from screen to screen. But what the beauty of Balsamiq is, you can also export it into a playable PDF. So that means, for example, for our bubble shooter, Zodiac Pop, I could make a playable bubble shooter in maybe 30 minutes. Later, when the laptop starts working, I'll show you all the GIFs of how Balsamiq works. But what's great is even without touching any art or code, I could already make something playable for everybody. And I just uploaded that to our hip chat, and people played it, and they're like, yeah, that's a bubble shooter. So now we know what the screens are. It's very good, obviously, for UI, but it's also good for things like retention layers and monetization layers, anything that's not gameplay related. And a lot of people forget this when they think of prototyping. They're only thinking of gameplay. But it's also very important that when you start a project, you know exactly how the tutorial is going to be. You know, what are your daily quests, and how are you going to make people come back? And you can do that in Balsamic. And you know, I'm a designer. I don't code, or I can't draw or anything to save my life. But I can make a pretty nice mock-up very quickly with Balsamic. So that's UX prototyping. What we found, though, is while it's very good to do that for things like game flow, it's terrible for doing gameplay. And how we learned that was we tried doing the same for our RPG. So we have a mid-core RPG that you can see outside. It's called Guardians of Therion. And just imagine it's like a 3 versus 3 RPG, turn-based. You have the elements. You have all sorts of characters and skills. And I'm like, I can totally mock that up. So, you know, our team of designers went and made a Balsamic of it. But the problem with a 3 versus 3 RPG is it's very complex. So when we tried to simulate the gameplay, so my character, for example, it's my character's turn, and now I have to choose which person to attack and which skill to use, and then transform into an animal and do all these things. Balsamic can't handle that. It's very simple and basic. It can't simulate player decisions. So anything that's too complex is not good for that. In fact, what we found is we just put a giant screen that says gameplay here, and then we just skip the entire battle. Because really, if you're doing UX prototyping, you want to test, you know, the map, the store, all the meta layers that when you start doing dev, you might actually tend to forget because you're so focused on the gameplay. UX prototyping is also very good for single screens, so quick revisions. So I don't know if you guys have done this, but I do this a lot. Like I would work out of coffee shops and things. And then when we would argue, you know, I want to revise this screen, or the store isn't working for me, I want to make it look like this. Then you draw on on the placemat or a piece of paper, and you're like this? And then no, like this? And that's what you would do in an office. But if you're working virtually, I have drawn on placemats and taken a picture, and then uploaded it like this, and then there's a delay. But Balsamic is great for that, because basically I can make a quick mock-up, move the buttons around, change the sizes, move the characters around like this, no, like this, export to PNG. It's super fast. So just imagine the Zodiac Pop, our bubble shooter. All those buttons are tappable, and you can really play the whole thing in a PDF. It's fantastic. And this is an example of a screen from our 3 versus 3 RPG. And you can see already just from that, we were trying to simulate, okay, what if a character is in training? What if a character is already to be claimed? What if a player does this or that? And it's just terrible. It's too clunky. It's really not good for any kind of complex game. That's my beautiful napkin sketch, which is real. Okay, so let's start from here. UX prototyping is really, really bad if you're trying to simulate game art. So for one of our games, our designer wanted to pitch his game, and so he made an interactive PDF. And the problem was, and that's not the worst screen because it's a GIF, but he put a lot of art into it. And so he put a lot of colors and text, and I couldn't understand what was going on. So really, again, prototyping has to be quick. So if you're taking too long to make it, if you're really obsessed with how it looks like, then it's probably not a good prototype. It's really better to just use black and white simple stuff. The second type of prototyping is what you guys are probably familiar with, which is standalone prototyping. When you ask the question, how does something feel like? So this is when you make a little prototype, like a throwaway APK or exe, and it's great for testing mechanics, and coders love doing this because they can do this without having any art assets or designers work on it. So for us, we use Unity, which is our engine, but we use a separate branch for it. And that actually forces everybody to consider it as a throwaway APK. You don't want to reuse this code. If you try to make the code clean, again, you're probably doing it too slow. So I would make a spec, and then in Unity, we would have a separate branch in source tree or make a new APK. That's a GIF. So imagine red stars running. That was actually our first prototype for Run on Super 5. And it's great for games where the mechanics are pretty much known. So when we were starting the company and we said, why don't we make a runner, what would that feel like? So our coder just made a runner really fast. And it's great for a tried and tested genre, but it's terrible for, again, really huge games. And for this one, I highly recommend a talk that was given last year at GDC called Dedicated Prototyping for Mobile Game Development by Backflip. And so they have a dedicated prototyping team, and all they do is prototype. Whenever anybody has a decision to make, they prototype it first, and then the whole team plays it. So we tried it because we thought that was a good idea, and we tried it for our 3 versus 3 RPG. Unfortunately, it didn't work for us. So for here, the GIF is basically the 3 cubes are fighting, and we're testing the initiative bars above their heads. And so, you kind of play it, and yeah, this works. And so we said, prototype success. But what happened was months later, when we put all the mechanics together, you put all the different kinds of skills, and we made it portrait and did a bunch of things to it, then nobody understood what the initiative bars meant. And I said, no, we prototyped that, everybody agreed that was the right decision, but then we had to reverse it and say, in the context of the bigger picture, it actually doesn't work very well. And so I would say it's great to use stuff like cube combat for maybe simpler games, or you're testing a simple mechanic that won't conflict with anything else. And the third type of prototyping is the in-game prototyping, which I'm sure a lot of you do as well. And this answers the question, how would that affect the game right now? And so what that means is you're already in development, and you want to test one thing. Maybe you're having an argument with someone, somebody had a better idea. Let's test it in the game really quick and see. And it's great for settling like what if, or feedback from conferences, or things like that, any new ideas. So here we still use Unity, because that's what we're using for the game, within the branch, and then we just make a new APK for whatever we're testing. And that's actually a video. One of our designers started doing this. He would prototype inside Unity, but instead of making a new build, he'd just take a video of his desktop and share the video, so we can make decisions really quickly without downloading the APK. So it's very good for testing one change. So for our RPG, our coder said, because right now it was tap to attack, and the coder said, I played this great game, and they were dragging the skill card to attack. So why don't we do that? And back and forth ideas, and then finally we're just like, hey, let's test it first and see if it's a good idea. So very quickly, he did the dragging, and we found it didn't work, because he was playing a landscape game. So when you're playing in landscape and you're dragging, you're not dragging across your party, but here you're kind of dragging over our party's heads, and it just felt very awkward and a waste of time. And we were able to test that quickly, and we didn't have to make cube combat or anything. It was just in the game, and he did one thing and then reversed it. It's terrible, though, if you start with art first. And this one might seem like an obvious lesson, but we had to learn it the hard way. Our art team had made this awesome boss in Dream Defense. It's that guy over there. And he was a huge summoner boss, and they're like, look at this pretty boss we made with all the effects and animation. What can we do with it? So they started to prototype how it would behave. And so the first behavior was it would stay at the edge of the screen and spawn a bunch of monsters. But we found that the frame rate was terrible, and the amount of monsters that it needed to spawn to be challenging couldn't be taken by normal phones. And so the designer said, well, that was a failure. Why don't we make him start moving forward slowly? And when he reaches the player, it's instant death. And then the art team said, oh, we didn't draw him to be like that. So if you look at him, he's completely cut, and he has no butt. And so it seems really simple, but guys, if you had prototyped the behavior first, then you wouldn't have drawn ourselves into a corner. And art really limits behavior, and people are hesitant to make changes once they've made something really beautiful like that. So after all that really static, imaginary GIF presentation, so you can see that we've tried prototyping in different situations. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So why would we have to prototype at all if it's not a 100% success rate? Well, first, it really does stop bad ideas before development starts. The earlier that you catch a bad idea, the cheaper it is for your company. Imagine all the art assets and the code assets and the time that you have spent on something that you realize 6 months later, if only you tried this other thing, maybe that would have been better. It's a great way to settle disputes objectively. So again, if you're arguing in chat, it can just be forever and ever. And now the whole company will be like, okay, guys, why don't we prototype both ideas and see which one is better? And the third is the design team in particular, they learn to look at all solutions. And they don't think necessarily that their idea is the best, They're open to listening to other people's ideas because they know that they can test it. And once you play it and you realize, yeah, you're right, your idea is better, you stop getting attached to your kind of ego and thinking that, you're the only one who knows how this game is going to go. Everybody has to test their ideas first. That's how it works. So how do you try to avoid some of the mistakes that we did? So first is you really have to keep your prototype simple. Answer just one question and do that. And you have to keep it quick and probably ugly and dirty. If you're an amazing coder and you can do really clean code in 5 minutes, that's great. Then your prototype can be clean. But honestly, the dirtier it is, the quicker it is, the better it is for everybody. Third, I would recommend that you use any tool you find appropriate. So we use Balsamiq and Unity, but some people in our company have used PowerPoint, paper, flowcharts, anything, Flash, anything that they feel would help them test an idea. That's fine, whatever works for you. And lastly, and this is super important, you have to prototype before any more work is done. Any kind of idea or any kind of feedback you get from these conferences, don't just take it at face value and do it. Test it right now before the entire team stops and does 3 more months of development on that feature that might not be a good idea. And so I think if you follow these 4 things, then chances are your prototype will be a success. I hope that made sense even without the pretty pictures, and I swear, if you want to pass by our booth, I'll show you all the GIFs. They're great. Thank you very much for bearing with me. And I would also love to find out how you guys prototype. So if we don't catch each other at the booth right outside, please email me. I would love to know how you do it in your studio. Thank you.
I would like to ask if there is a way to determine if a feature is too big to prototype in a very short time. Because in our development experience, we somehow tried to make an RPG game, and then somehow the feature that we're trying to experiment took something that what I consider is not quick at all, and I can't really determine any way to implement it in a quick way, even though I can implement it in a dirty way. That's easier. So, is there a way to resolve such type of features that you want to experiment through prototyping?
Okay, so that's a good question. The question was, is there a way to find out if a feature is too large to prototype? Did I get that correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
There is no real standard or time limit. I would say that you would have to set one with your team, or depending on how fast you work. For example, what Backflip does is to prevent that is they really test each mechanic separately. So if you were doing an RPG, for example, you would test the control scheme as a different prototype from the HP bars, as a different prototype from maybe attacking in place versus attacking forward, and things like that. But that's how they broke it down. For us, that didn't actually work, but we use other things like Jira, for example, where we really break down our tasks into manageable chunks. And our chunks don't last longer than a week, I believe. So if the feature would take longer than a week to do, or if the prototype would take longer than a week to do, it's probably too big and we would hunker it down. I would say whatever works for the speed of your coders or whoever's prototyping. I hope I answered your question. It really depends on what you're doing.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful presentation. In regards to the previous question, but I thought in your PowerPoint you mentioned that sometimes the mechanics actually influence one another. So if you were to do testing on each separate mechanic, how should I put it? But sometimes the mechanics will actually influence one another. So how do you resolve that? How do you know whether the mechanics will clash with one another when you put them back together in a big system?
Okay, so the question was, if you're separating mechanics and prototyping them separately, how do you know if they're going to affect each other when you put them together? Did I get that right? Okay, well, again, that depends on how you want to divide your work into chunks. For us, it's more, first we divide it by feature. So let's say battle, right? But you know that's too big. And then you're going to look at the different aspects of battle. So I would say, how about the control system is definitely separate from how the UI is going to look like. So I can prototype the control system separately. But for games like, let's say, a bubble shooter, when you're supposed to shoot the bubbles, it makes no sense to separate the mechanics there, because just shooting, the act of shooting and bouncing against the walls and switching bubbles, all of that can just be one chunk. I would say, and I would ask your coders because they're the ones doing the bulk of the work when you're doing this. What are the chunks that they feel comfortable working in? Because chances are they're not going to want to work on a big chunk anyway. They're going to get lost. So it's also task management and work management. Honestly, a lot of it is trial and error as well. So for us, we tried the separate mechanic thing that didn't work out for us. If you had time, and I know that's precious in game development, but if you had time and you wanted to try the prototyping thing out, see how granular you can be with your prototypes until it gets uncomfortable. And then you're going to find it's probably somewhere in the middle area. You can prototype 2 or 3 things together. So let's say you would prototype the attack, for example, in an RPG. You could prototype melee and ranged at the same time and see how that works. And it doesn't really make sense to break it together. Sadly, a lot of that is, again, depending on what kind of game you're doing.
Thank you so much, Luna.
Thank
and
you.
please
Thank you,
do check
everybody.
out the Indie Prize after lunch. Thank you so much.